I'm so excited to have on Cameron Huddleston, who wrote the book Mom and Dad, We Need to Talk: How to Have Essential Conversations with Your Parents About Their Finances. She's also an award-winning journalist with more than 18 years of experience writing about personal finance. Welcome, Cameron.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
It's such a pleasure. So I have to tell you, when I first heard about your work, before I'd really had a chance to dive deeper into it, I remember thinking that, okay, how to talk to your parents about money, that could be really valuable for some of my friends because some of my friends have parents whose finances are a total mess. But there's nothing really in this for me because my parents are so incredibly prepared with their money. They think about it so much. They've got the financial advisors, they've got the wills and the living trust, they've got everything taken care of. So I don't really have to worry about this, do I? And I remember thinking, okay, this is good. I want to talk to Cameron because it could help other people, those people. But there's nothing in it really for me, I don't think. So can you mention that, talk to that for a moment? Is that true that somebody who has parents who are really strong with their money don't have to worry about these conversations?
No, everyone needs to have these conversations. The fact that your parents are on top of their finances just makes things a little bit easier for you. And the reason that all adult children need to be having these conversations is because they will likely have to get involved with their parents' financial lives as they age. And of course, everyone does die. And so you're going to have to be getting involved with your parents' finances at that point too. The reason I say you're going to have to get involved with your parents' finances because people are living longer. There's a greater chance that they will have health issues. They will require long-term care. Even if there is no health issue, as we age, our financial decision-making ability declines. And so that makes your parents more susceptible to fraud and financial abuse. As the child, of course you can say, well, whatever, it's not my problem. It's my parents' money. If they get scammed and they lose their money, too bad. But, of course, if you have a good relationship with your parents and you want to return that same favor that they provided for you all those years while they were raising you, caring for you, giving you a loving home, and you want to provide that same sort of care for them when they're older, you need to have some details about their finances so that it is easy for you to step in and help. And this is especially true in the United States because there are legal requirements. I suspect that this is true in a lot of parts of the world, but you can't simply go into your parents' bank account and start making transactions. If mom's in the hospital because she had a stroke and you want to make sure you can pay the bills for her, you have to have the legal right to do so. And so that requires certain legal documents to be in place. If your parents have done their estate planning, that's great for you. That's one less hurdle you have to overcome when you're having these conversations. But you need to know, do they have these documents? You need to know, where do they bank? How can you access those bank accounts if you have to pay the bills for them? What bills do they have? If they need long-term care and you're going to have to be the one managing their finances, you need to know what finances are there to pay for that sort of care, or you need to know whether your parents are counting on you. There are lots of things that need to be discussed. Of course, if you have parents who are not on top of their finances, then you're going to have a lot more conversations. You might need to be talking about, hey, mom and dad, are you counting on me to provide support for you in retirement? Hey, mom and dad, you need to have a plan for retirement. Hey, mom and dad, you need to meet with an attorney to draw up all these documents. For people like you, Dave, like I said, it's just going to be a little bit easier, but the conversations are still necessary.
That's really what struck me as I was listening to you on other podcasts and reading your book. The power of attorney thing really got to me. And what really hit me was that you don't really know when a person is going to get to the point where they can't make decisions on their own. They can't legally make decisions, or they can't legally cede the power to somebody else to make decisions. That if I wait too long, if somebody has dementia or has a stroke, dementia you can maybe see going on little by little, but if they have a stroke, maybe the court will no longer allow them to sign over power of attorney.
Exactly. So A big reason that you want to have these conversations is so that you can be prepared. You and your parents can be prepared for those emergencies. Because, like you said, you never know when it's going to happen. And if you are prepared, it's one less thing to worry about. If you wait until that emergency happens, then it can be too late. And you mentioned the power of attorney, which I mentioned too. This is a legal document that lets you name someone or more than one person to make financial decisions for you if you're not able to yourself. This document has to be signed while you are mentally competent. So if you have a stroke and you're in a coma, you can't sign that document. Your child or another family member or a loved one is going to have to go to court and petition the court to become your guardian or conservator. This can be a very lengthy process. It can be a very expensive process because essentially you're putting your parent on trial. You have to get a doctor to testify that your parent is no longer competent. You have to prove that you are responsible enough to manage your finances, and the court should appoint you to be the guardian or conservator. So this is a process that no family should have to go through, and it can be easily avoided simply by getting that power of attorney document. There is a cost, of course, and typically this sort of document is drawn up when you're doing other estate planning documents, a will or a living trust, an advanced healthcare directive that spells out what sort of end-of-life medical care you do or do not want, and also lets you name a healthcare proxy to make medical decisions for you if you can't. In the United States, this can cost, several $100s to $1,000 or more, but going to court, that can cost thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of dollars even. And, in the meantime, while you can't access your parents' bank account to pay bills for them, you might have to be paying those bills out of your own pocket. So yes, there is a cost, but it's going to be a lot smaller than those potential costs that you could face if those documents aren't in place.
Something you said struck me just there that I'd kind of missed, a bit of nuance about the power of attorney. You said that the power of attorney could give me authority if my parents are unable to be making decisions for themselves. And I kind of missed that aspect of the if when I heard about the power of attorney. I thought of it as this kind of dangerous document, like, well, who would want to sign a power of attorney giving somebody else authority over their medical decisions, their financial decisions? But I guess the power of attorney is conditional. If I wind up in situation A, then it kicks in only at that point?
Well, it depends on the type of power of attorney. And this is the reason why it's so good to meet with an attorney rather than to use the DIY type of document that you can find online. Those documents are available. They are cheaper than what you would pay for to have an attorney drafted. But when you meet with an attorney, you can discuss your specific situation and what sort of power you want to give your power of attorney. If you talk to an estate planning attorney, they're going to tell you that the general durable power of attorney is best. And this essentially gives someone power right away, which is scary for a lot of people because, like you said, that's a lot of power you could potentially be giving up. The way that you can get around that, if you are talking to your parents and they're very reluctant to hand over this sort of power, is all you have to do is simply tell your parents, look, mom and dad, yes, you're naming me your power of attorney. If you're giving me general durable power of attorney that typically takes effect now, I don't have any real power unless I have that document. No bank, no financial institution is just going to take my word for it that I'm your power of attorney. I have to have the document. So what you can do is put it someplace safe. Tell me how to access it and under what conditions. You can even ask your parents to write those conditions down, those scenarios when you would be allowed to start using that power of attorney. Now, there are springing power of attorney documents that say these conditions have to be met. I have to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. I have to have had a stroke and no longer can make decisions on my own. The problem with that is that you typically have to have a doctor or more than one doctor who can verify that you are no longer competent. And so it can make it difficult for your power of attorney to step in and start managing your finances for you. Yes, this requires a lot of trust. And that's why it's so important to name someone you trust. So If you're the child who is listening to this and you think I need to talk to my parents, but maybe you don't have the best relationship with your parents, maybe it's better that you have a sibling who's closer to mom and dad. It needs to be at least one of the kids having these conversations. Ideally, all of you want to be on the same page, but if you're not the one with the best relationship with your parents, maybe another sibling who is closer, who has that better relationship, your parents trust more, maybe they had the conversation and maybe they're the one who's named power of attorney, because it is a huge responsibility.
Yeah, and everything you're saying makes so much logical sense. But emotionally, the idea of having these conversations with your parents and say, okay, mom, dad, let's face it, you're getting up there. We don't know how long you've got. I need to know what to do with your money. Like, oof, it doesn't sound very comfortable. Some of the money and relationships issues I've dug into in the past talk about dealing with spouses, and people have the hardest time even talking to their spouses about money. Talking with children is hard, but none of them seem so hard as this one. The people, especially if you've had parents kind of like mine who've been so responsible with their money, and their money's been their thing. And I was brought up to think that money is something fairly private. It's not something we talk about so much. So broaching that subject, it seems difficult. And I know you've got a whole section of your book on what not to say. So I love that section. Can you go into some of what not to say, and then maybe we can look at what to say?
Sure. So, Dave, what you don't want to say is what you just said. Mom and dad, you're getting old. Okay. You don't want the reason these conversations can be tricky in part is because it brings up fears about aging and death. And a lot of people are really, really afraid to think about their own mortality. Like, my dad didn't like to talk about it. My dad didn't like to talk about money either. If you asked him, what do you want us to do with your body when you die? He would say, well, just sharpen my toes and hammer me into the ground. Like, I kid you not. And my mother, after my parents got divorced, my mother kept saying to me, you have got to find out what your dad really wants. You need to know what his final wishes are. And he didn't want to talk about it. And I know some people think if you talk about death, that's it. You're going to die tomorrow. It brings on your early demise. And I can tell you that is not true. It is not true, because my husband and I, we've actually written a will, and we've gone through the process again to update it, and we're still here. My father, who died without a will and didn't want to talk about death, he was 61 years old. So talking about and planning for your death does not bring on your early demise. Really, trust me with that. But because parents are afraid to talk about this issue, at least some of them are, you don't want to approach it from the point of you are aging and you're going to die someday. You want to approach it out of respect and out of love, because these are your parents, and you have to realize that they might think their money is private. They might think it's taboo to talk. So I was saying, knowing why they might be afraid to talk is going to help you figure out what approach to take and what not to say. So you certainly don't want to be condescending and talk down to them. And you don't want to say, mom and dad, you're getting old, and people are going to start taking advantage of you. We really need to talk so that I can help protect you as you get older. You don't want to issue ultimatums to them saying, if you don't talk to me, I'm not going to help you. You don't want to look like you're only thinking about yourself. That, saying something like, hey, I need to know if you have a will because I need to know what I'm getting. What you want to say is, hey, mom and dad, if something were to happen to you, I want to know what sort of plan you have in place. Do you have estate planning documents? I don't need to know what they say necessarily. I just need to know if you have them. I need to know if you have your wishes written down. I need to know if you've named someone to make financial or healthcare decisions for you if you aren't able to. And I need to know where those documents are. The point is not to get them, at least off the bat, to divulge figures, to tell you whether you're in the will and how much you're getting. You just want to know what sort of planning they've done. Start there. Don't scare them by asking them, how much money have you saved for retirement? How much is in your bank account? Are you expecting me to take care of you when you get older? you have to ease into these conversations because you don't want to scare them off and shut down. Now, it can take several tries to get the conversation going. It can take several different approaches, but some of the ways that you can do it naturally is to use a story about someone you know, perhaps someone whose parent died without a will, and how difficult it was for them to have to figure out what that parent might have wanted, especially at a time when they were grieving. Or maybe you can share a story about a colleague who had to stop working to help care for a parent who had a long-term care need. Stories are a great way to get the conversation started naturally. You can talk about what if scenarios. What if something happened and you were in the hospital? How would I make sure your bills got paid? I had a friend who did this and it worked so well. Her mother, who was divorced and living on her own, said to my friend, she's like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you asked that because I never thought of it." And went home, made a list of all her bills and how she paid them. And it was that simple. You could, if you're still young, ask your parents for advice about your finances. And that's going to give you a clue into the sort of financial planning they've done. "Hey, mom and dad, I just got married. Do I need a will? Do I need life insurance?" And they might say, "Oh, yes, of course you do, because we got life insurance the day we got married and we got a will." Or they might say, "I don't know. We never bothered to do that." And then you start asking more questions. "Oh, really? Because I read that it's really important to have a will because if you die without one, state law is going to decide who gets what." And you keep the conversation going from there.
Okay, great. One thing I heard you mention was this whole idea of really making it very clear that you're not in this for selfish purposes, that you have a bigger picture. But I kept wondering while I was going through your book, is there any point that it actually is okay to be somewhat selfish in these conversations? One person who came up to my mind as a friend, we'll call him Joe, whose mom, Sylvia, had inherited actually quite a bit of money a few decades ago. And in Joe's eyes, Sylvia doesn't spend her money so well. And she's got a bunch of friends in poor financial circumstances who she's always supporting. And Joe's kind of watching this inheritance go down, 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 down. And on the one hand, Joe's concerned about Sylvia because, her health has been poor and they thought they'd lose her several times and she's managed to pull through and want to make sure there's enough to actually provide for her for the rest of her life. On the other hand, Joe's like, you know what? I've been expecting that there'd be an inheritance here and that this money maybe would put my kids through college. And I see mom's just giving it away to all these people. She's not managing it well. Is it ever okay to have a more selfish aspect in this conversation, to be saying, "Hey, mom, look, there are your needs, but also, this money could really help me too. And I want to make sure that there's some left over for me and my kids to have."
I think it's entirely natural to have selfish reasons for wanting to have this conversation, especially if you're talking to your parent because you have suspicions that parent might rely on you for financial support as they get older, because that's going to impact your finances. And you need to know what level of support they might need so that you can make changes to what you're doing. You can adjust your own situation, or you can actually prepare yourself emotionally for saying to your parents, "Look, there's only so much I can do. And maybe I can do this, but I can't do everything." But as far as having those conversations to talk to your parents about whether you're going to be getting an inheritance, getting kind of a second generational inheritance like your friend, I would say tread lightly. I would say that should not be how you start the conversation. I think, and we'll just use our friend Joe as an example. I would say for someone like that, he would want to point out to his mother, "Hey, mom, I I want to make sure that there is money available, the funds are available to pay for your care if you ever need it. I want you to make sure that you get the best care money can buy." Again, letting your parent know you're looking out for their best interest. And mom, I want to talk a little bit to you about this inheritance that you have, which I think is wonderful. You are so fortunate that there is this money there. Have you thought about, you know, if something were to happen and you needed care, have you thought about hanging on to a certain dollar amount of that money so that it is there to pay for your care. Getting that parent to think about how they're spending that money and making sure that there's enough if they have that care, because a lot of times we don't want to have to think about the possibility that we will need long-term care. And I think most people don't realize how dang expensive it is.
Oh yeah.
So incredibly expensive. And I think also most people don't realize that Medicare does not pay for long-term care. It doesn't. It will pay for short-term care after you've been hospitalized in a skilled nursing facility, but it's not going to pay for the type of care you need if you are bound to a wheelchair and you cannot function the way you normally would and you need round-the-clock assisted living care. It's not going to pay for the type of care you would need if you have dementia. Any sort of long-term care that's longer than 6 months, Medicare does not pay for that. Medicaid will, but you have to meet income requirements, meaning you have to have very limited income. So you're going to either pay for it out of pocket, or you're going to have a long-term care insurance policy. You're going to have a life insurance policy with a long-term benefit, or you start rating your retirement account. So, your friend who's concerned about his mom, he would probably want to start by focusing on that, focusing on making sure the money is there for her, and then perhaps, bringing it up. And if you want to be careful about it, again, perhaps say, Mom, I know how much you care about leaving a legacy. So couching it in those terms, I know, or asking your parent
Good
directly,
spin. Yeah.
how do you feel about leaving a legacy? Is this important for you? Are you hoping to pass something on to, your children, your grandchildren? Because that is incredibly important for some people. Not everyone. I mean, there are plenty of people who say it's my money, I'm going to spend it, and that's fine. It's their choice. But if you know that this is something that is important to your parent, you can ask them, how do you feel about leaving a legacy? Is it important that you pass on money to children or, your grandchildren? Because how grandparents are about their grandkids. Most of them are crazy about them. So maybe it's not about you, but the grandkids. And, Mom, I know that you are such a generous person and you're wanting to, support some of your friends, but I know it's also important for you perhaps to pass on some of these things to your own grandchildren and help support them through college. So again, being very careful not to look like you're just trying to make a money grab.
You're absolutely right about this cost of healthcare near the end of life. I remember reading recently, I don't know if this is an exactly correct stat, but I'd read that the last 6 months of life take about half the cost of healthcare goes into just the end of life period, that our whole healthcare system, like, it is such an expensive period. People need so much care. And it's, as I'm now preparing for retirement and trying to set aside money and thinking what I need to be financially independent, that comes up, like, that my costs that I might need might be absolutely skyrocketing at a certain point. So that's a great point.
And it is such a huge cost. Just to give you an idea, the median cost of long-term care in an assisted living facility or with a home health aide is around $4,500 a month. Skilled nursing is going to cost twice that much in a private room. So if you are in your 50s in good health, you can get a long-term care insurance policy that's going to cover you for several years, provide several $100,000 worth of benefits for around $300 a month, if you are in good health, which I know that sounds very expensive, but compared to 4,500 a month, that's a bargain. That is certainly a bargain. So, talking to your parents about whether they have a way to pay for long-term care is really an important part of this equation, because for most people, they end up relying on family to provide that care. Maybe initially it's a spouse, but it's good to point out to your parents, hey, Dad, you might be counting on Mom to help you out, but if you're 80 years old and Mom is too, is Mom going to have the physical and emotional strength to help you get out of bed every morning, to help you get dressed, to help you get in and out of the shower, to help you get up and down the stairs? People don't think about these things. And then, at least get them thinking. And they might not answer you right away, but you might be surprised. They might come back a month later and say, we've been thinking about this, and we realize we need a plan. Because most parents don't want to be a burden on their kids. And if Mom or Dad is single, you could be that care provider. That means you have to stop working, because I can tell you that caregiving can be a full-time job, and it can last for many years depending on the condition your parent has. And I will tell you too that about half of adults who are 65 years old today will need long-term care at some point in the rest of their lives. So there's a
Wow.
very good chance that one or both of your parents, excuse me, will need some sort of long-term care.
Okay. Wow. That's
Shocking,
something to think
right?
about. It's shocking. Yes, it really is. I want to get into the question of when is too early or too late to have these conversations. I've got a 15-year-old son at this point. I'm 46. Is this absolutely too early to be bringing these things up? And on the flip side, when's it too late? If a parent has in the early stages of dementia, at that point, is the power of attorney already beyond them because they have like a few symptoms, or they need to have like pretty severe dementia before they could actually no longer sign a legal document?
So I will say, starting with the when is it too early, before we get into when it's too late, really, ideally, you should be having these conversations when your parents are relatively young and relatively healthy, because of all the things we've already discussed. It gives you more time to plan. It gives you time to make sure those legal documents are in place. You're not having to respond in an emergency. That could be when your parents are in their early 50s. You're in your 40s, I'm in my 40s. I have had conversations with my kids, but not at the same level that someone who would be in, say, their 20s or 30s would be having with their parents. I've told my kids that my husband and I are taking steps to be prepared in case we need care, so that they won't have to be the one to provide us that care. We've discussed what our final wishes are with our kids. We've discussed who the guardians are. We've had those sort of discussions with them. But I would say if you're in your 20s and 30s, this is a good time to have the conversation with your parents, especially because if you're young and starting out, like I said, you can go to your parents and ask them for financial advice.
Right.
Under the guise of getting information, from them about their finances. Hey, I need your advice. What should I do? And you're going to get clues. Is there a point when it's ever too late? Certainly, if there is that emergency, yes, you need to be talking to your parents. You need to be getting some information so that if you're the one who has to step in and help, you can start doing that. With my mother, she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's when she was 65. She was living on her own, and I had to play detective to find out information about her finances. Part of the reason why I wrote this book is because I had not had those detailed conversations with my mom, not because I was afraid to, but because it just wasn't something I thought about. Even as a financial journalist, it wasn't a conversation I realized I needed to have. Something to know, though, and this is coming from an estate planning attorney I spoke with, a diagnosis of Alzheimer's does not determine competency. So my mother, we actually met with an attorney right around the time she was diagnosed, and she was still competent enough. The attorney found her competent enough to sign those documents. So I would say if your parent has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and is still in the early stage, an attorney might consider your parent competent enough to sign that document. Ideally, you don't want to even be in that situation. That's why having the conversation while your parent is still healthy is so much better, because that document can be in place and you're, less likely to run up against that risk of your parent being considered incompetent, and then you have to go to court.
Right. As a former attorney myself, I understand how you want to avoid court at all cases. I
Right.
want to talk about siblings for a moment. So here I am. My situation might be a little bit unusual, that I grew up in Connecticut and my parents still live there. And I've picked up and I've moved halfway around the world to Jerusalem. So I'm very far away. And one of the things that gives me some comfort being so far away is that I've got siblings closer to home. And especially, with all due respect to my brother, the one who gives me the most comfort is my sister, who lives about 2 hours away from my parents. And I just know she's an incredibly responsible person. She's somebody who, if my parents got sick, she would absolutely be there and she'd be on the scene. And I know I could really rely on her to be picking up a lot of that slack. So I guess one of the questions that I have is, to what extent can I be like, oh, okay, this is Jessica's realm. She's the kind of responsible sibling who lives near home, who I think both my brother John and I, we both kind of expect, okay, she'll be the one to kind of step in if anything happens. I get so much comfort from knowing she lives nearby. But, at what point is it all right for one sibling to be like, okay, this other sibling, that's probably going to be the one to step in? Or at what point do I have to say, no, like, she's probably not asking these questions, even if she's going to be the one ultimately to probably take the lion's share of the burden on the day-to-day stuff. I need to make sure that I'm on top of this, that I'm part of it. Maybe the power of attorney should extend to all of us. What are the types of sibling conversations we should be having around this?
Ideally, you should be talking to your siblings before you even talk to your parents. And there are a couple of different reasons why I say this. First, you want to make sure you guys are all on the same page. You, in your head, are saying, my sister's going to be in charge. She might have no idea that you're counting on her to do this. And so suddenly something happens to mom or dad, and you're like, well, come on, Jessica, I expected you to be in charge. And she's like, what? No, I expected you, Dave. So you don't want to run into that situation where suddenly one child is expecting one thing, the other child is expecting another, and no one knows what to do when something happens to mom or dad. The other reason you want to do it is, say you're the one to go talk to your parent, and you don't tell your siblings that you're doing this, and then they find out later. They might be upset. They might think that you're going behind their back to talk to mom and dad about how much money you're getting, and you're trying to kind of gain their favor and get a bigger share of what mom and dad is going to leave behind. So you don't want to create any resentment. That's why it's so important to try to talk to your siblings. Now, I know that in plenty of families, not all siblings get along. And so this conversation is not going to be easy, but I would suggest that you at least attempt to have the conversation. Let your siblings know by phone call, by email, that you want to talk. And you can tell them, exactly what it is you want to talk about. Sometimes email can even be best. Hey, let's find a time where we can hop on the phone or do a FaceTime. We can talk about, why we should all be talking to mom and dad about the finances. Here are some things I want to hash out. And it's good when you have these conversations to discuss those roles each of you is willing to play. So you expect your sister, because she lives closer, to have more of a hands-on role, but she might not necessarily feel comfortable. And so she might say, well, hey, I thought you were going to be doing that. You can discuss these sort of things and have a plan. And then when you do go to your parents and talk, whether it's all of you or just one of you, you can let your parents know that you and your brothers and sisters have had this conversation. We've talked about this, mom and dad. We want to be able to help you. We want you to know that we're here for you. And because we want to be able to help you, that's why we need to get some information from you. I think sometimes it can be a relief to parents to hear that their children are all on the same page, because sometimes parents can be reluctant to have these conversations because they're afraid that there is going to be fighting among the siblings. And they want to avoid that. I mean, parents oftentimes won't talk about their wills. And I've had estate planning attorneys tell me this. I don't want to tell my kids about my will. I don't want to tell them who's getting what, because I don't want them to fight. And I might be giving so-and-so more, but guess what? They can fight it out after I'm gone, because I don't want to have to deal with it. People say this sort of thing. And so, again, it's not, when you're talking to your siblings, reminding them, look, we're not having these conversations to find out who's getting what. We're having these conversations so that we can help mom and dad. And maybe we're not in 100% agreement about how to do it, but at least we can try to get on the same page, figure out who's going to have the conversation, who's going to do what. And, perhaps you are in a situation where you could provide some financial support for your parents, but you're not there to give that hands-on sort of care. So maybe you would say, look, Jessica, I know you might be doing all the heavy lifting, but I'm willing to contribute financially. I can't help you get mom and dad to the doctor's appointments, but I can, send you some money every month, or I can create an emergency fund for mom and dad, or an emergency fund for you if you have to stop working. Those are the type of things that you can discuss with your siblings just to make it easier, because, unfortunately, it usually does fall on one sibling to handle most of the care. Usually, if it's a woman, it's going to fall on her. The daughter's going to do it. And so, speaking from experience, it is incredibly difficult and overwhelming to be a caregiver. I do have a sister, but she lives several states away. And so she can't physically be here to help my mom. I'm the financial person too, so it all falls on me. And it's a lot and it can be overwhelming. So any sort of support you can give your siblings is a good thing because you don't want your siblings to resent you and you don't want these
Yeah.
sort of things to tear you apart as a family.
Would you recommend having all the siblings on the power of attorney? Or I guess that's the part of the discussion the siblings have, who is going to be the one to have the responsibility?
And honestly, you can discuss which one of you is more comfortable in that role, but at the end of the day, it's up to your parents to decide. So your parents can decide they might want all of you, and they might want to create a sort of system of checks and balances where, if one person is signing something, another one of the kids who's the power of attorney also has to sign it. With my mother's power of attorney, I can sign independently. My sister does
Gotcha.
not have to sign also. But if you want to make sure that all the kids are involved and that, one kid is looking over the other kid's shoulders, they can require that with their power of attorney. Or they might say, Dave, I'm naming you power of attorney, but I expect you to submit a monthly or annual report to your siblings about what you're doing with my money. So, the parents get to decide, but if the children step up and say, hey, I'm willing to fill this role, then it might make it easier for the parents to make that decision.
Okay, great. So I want to get to the final question here. Can you just give me a list? What are the key pieces of information that I must know from my parents? And what are the key authorizations that I must have?
Okay, so definitely you need to find out whether they have those estate planning documents, a will or living trust, which spells out who gets what when they die, what's called a living will or an advanced healthcare directive that spells out their end of life medical treatment they do or do not want. And it names usually a healthcare proxy to make medical decisions for them, and the power of attorney, which we've been talking about. You need to find out, if you can only find out one thing, find out if they have those documents and where they are. If they don't, encourage your parents to meet with an attorney as soon as possible. If they can't afford it and you can, offer to pitch in, as a holiday gift or a Mother's Day or a Father's Day gift. I want to do this for you because it's important that I know what your wishes are and I know that they're in writing. Find out those sort of things. Next thing, if you can find out how they pay their bills, this is for that sort of emergency planning. Are they writing a check or are they having their bills paid automatically? If they're writing a check, I would encourage you to offer to help your parents set up automatic bill payment. Say, hey, mom and dad, this is one less thing you're going to have to worry about every month. And if something happens to you and you're in the hospital, you're going to know that your bills are being paid. If they're writing a check and they insist on it, again, it goes back to that power of attorney. You can't sign a check for them unless you've been named their power of attorney. So how are their bills paid? Where do they bank? If you've got to go talk to the bank, you need to know what bank it is. If they're willing to give you that sort of information, dig a little deeper. What are their sources of income? What sort of insurance policies do they have? What sort of investments do they have? Do they have any debt? They don't necessarily have to give you dollar amounts, but knowing, yes, I have a pension from my former employer. I'm relying only on Social Security. I have retirement savings and a 401k that I've rolled over to an IRA. Knowing these sort of things is helpful. Again, do they have a plan for paying for long-term care? If you can get account usernames and passwords, you find out where the lockbox key is, where the birth certificates are, the military papers, what their social security number is. If you have to become a financial caregiver for a parent and help manage their finances, you will need all of this information. And they don't necessarily have to tell you if you can get them to write it down. Make a list, especially with those usernames and passwords. If they have those online accounts, that's great. It's golden. It's going to make your life a lot easier. You won't have to play detective like I did with my mom.
Wow. Thank you so much for all of that. I can't actually say that I'm happier having read your book. I think I'm more stressed having read your book, having learned everything that I was before, but I feel a lot more prepared. And again, the book is Mom and Dad, We Need to Talk, How to Have Essential Conversations with Your Parents About Their Finances. Cameron, how can people find you and learn more?
I do have some free resources on my website. I have a free downloadable in case of emergency form that you can print out and give to your parents, and they can put all that essential information that you might need someday. I have a scam red flag sheets that you can print out and actually use as a conversation starter with your parents. Hey, mom and dad, I found this online. Hang it up by the phone. Want to talk to you about scams because they're so prevalent. So those are two free resources that people can get from my website.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I've learned an absolute ton about this. Again, I feel a little intimidated. I'm done. I was happier when I didn't think I had to have this conversation, but I'm coming out of this feeling like, okay, this is a really important conversation to be having, and I feel like I'm going to be a lot better prepared having learned all this. The book was terribly informative, and I highly recommend it to all of our listeners. And thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.